I'm Nikki Hardiman, and I'm glad you're joining us for study at FaithElement. I'm here to provide you with some background information on your biblical passage for today. The text for this week is Luke 4, 1 through 13. In this text, we hear the story of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. As we begin reading this text, we're reminded that Jesus has just returned from the Jordan River where he was baptized. This is also the place where Jesus is called to his public ministry as the Son of God. Next, we are told that Jesus is led in the wilderness by the Spirit. Now, it's easy for us to kind of read that the Spirit sent Jesus into the wilderness. But Luke really seems to be implying that the Spirit acts as a guide for Jesus while he's there. It is likely that Jesus has gone into the wilderness to fulfill some kind of vow before he begins his public ministry in his role as God's Son. In the ancient world, a son represented his father. If you met a son, then you knew the father because the son was his representative. Also, kings were sometimes called the Son of God in the Old Testament because they were considered to be God's representatives on earth. Likewise, we can understand that because Jesus is God's Son, we may know what God is like by paying attention to Jesus. Each of the temptations that Jesus faced addressed his identity as the Son of God. You can almost hear the question being asked. Exactly what kind of Son of God was Jesus going to be? Will he succumb to the desire for power? Or will he live a little differently than the rest of us? The first temptation that Jesus faces is to live by his own self-reliance, by making his own food out of a stone. Now, whether or not this is something Jesus could actually do is beside the point. If he had even attempted it, Jesus would have demonstrated that he was choosing to rely on his own strength rather than God's. However, Jesus demonstrates his understanding that he can only rely on God when he quotes Deuteronomy 8:3, "One does not live by bread alone." The second temptation Jesus faces is to take a worldly form of power rather than the power that he receives from God. The only price is to bow down and worship Satan. Jesus finds his strength to resist the lure of power by calling to mind Deuteronomy 6:13, "Worship the Lord your God and serve only him." The third and final temptation Jesus faces happens when Satan takes Jesus to the top of the temple in Jerusalem and tells him to prove that he is the Son of God by throwing himself down and letting the angels save him. Jesus faces a similar situation when he's being crucified. The crowds are passing by and they look at him and say, "If you are indeed the Son of God, why don't you just save yourself?" The temptation here is to show off and to use God's power to gain recognition. Jesus again quotes Scripture, Deuteronomy 6:16, "Do not test the Lord your God." So, exactly what kind of Messiah was Jesus going to be? Satan wanted him to be self-reliant, power-hungry, and a bit of a show-off. Truth be told, those who followed him also wanted Jesus to have a few more of those kind of qualities. They wanted him to rule on earth and rescue them from the oppressive Roman government. However, this is not the kind of Messiah that Jesus was called to be, and his responses to these three temptations show us that. At the same time, we may consider that there was a part of Jesus that desired to live just by his own means, to get more earthly power than God's power, and to enjoy the recognition that comes from being God's chosen one. After all, this is the temptation story. It's nice for us to think that these tests were easy for Jesus to pass. But stories like this don't usually get told if they're easy. Jesus struggled with these things, and it was likely not just in the wilderness. These are probably the things that Jesus faced on a regular basis as he went about his ministry. So, how exactly did we get this story? None of the disciples were around to witness the events. This means that Jesus had to share the experience with his disciples. Can you imagine him sharing this story with them? What it meant for him to confess to them what he struggled with. Maybe part of the way Jesus kept from succumbing to the things that tempted him was to tell his friends that he had them in the first place. It's much easier to pretend that something isn't real if no one else knows about it. Jesus struggled just as we do with some of the same things that we struggle with. Perhaps we can take comfort and courage from his own act of confession to his friends. Perhaps we can share our own struggles with someone that we trust as a way of confronting them and moving through them. We can take comfort in recalling a scripture from the book of Hebrews. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are.